Before Dracula, there was something older, more silent, more persistent, more feared. Its name was whispered, not spoken. The Strigoi. In the quiet valleys of Romania, long before cinema and silver bullets, long before vampires became fashionable lovers or cursed aristocrats, there were stories raw, local, and rooted in dirt. These were tales not meant to thrill, but to warn, to protect, to explain the unexplainable. And above all, they spoke of one thing: the dead who would not stay dead. The Strigoi is not a singular creature, but a presence, shape-shifting, contradictory, and terrifyingly intimate. In some stories, it's a soul that rises from the grave, gaunt and hungry. In others, it never died at all, but lived among the village, hiding in plain sight, slowly draining life from its family. It is not some foreign invader. It is your neighbor, your cousin, your child. And that is what makes it terrifying. Because the Strigoi is not a beast from the shadows. It is the shadow within. The word Strigoi likely derives from the Latin strix, meaning screech owl, a creature associated with night, death, and blood. But in Romanian folklore, it evolved into something more layered. There are two kinds of Strigoi: the Strigoi mort, a dead person returned from the grave, and the Strigoi viu, a living person cursed with vampiric tendencies, destined to rise after death. What marks a Strigoi? Signs vary by region and belief, but some are chillingly consistent. If a baby is born with a caul, if it has teeth at birth, if a person dies without confession, if someone was wicked cursed or even just envied, they may return. Sometimes the signs are subtle: a sudden illness spreading in a family, milk curdling without cause, animals refusing to enter a home. Sometimes they're direct: a knock at the window, a pale face seen at the edge of the forest, a dead man's voice calling in the night. You may dismiss this as rural superstition, but imagine you are a 17th century villager, isolated at the mercy of harsh winter's crop failure plague. Medicine is scarce, explanations are few, and then your healthy brother dies, then your daughter, then your neighbor. You bury them, you pray, but still, the sickness comes. What do? You remember the old stories. You speak to the wise woman, you dig up the grave, and sometimes what you find chills your bones. The body looks untouched. There is fresh blood at the lips. The nails have grown. The heart beats just faintly. You know then what you must do. The heart must be removed. The mouth stuffed with garlic or thorns. The body burned, or nailed to the coffin with an iron spike. These are not acts of cruelty, they are acts of survival. Because the Strigoi is not just a monster, it is a rupture in the natural order, a soul that refuses rest, a hunger that forgets its name. And it is always hungry. Many scholars point to these stories as precursors to the vampire legends that would later spread through Europe, especially the infamous Dracula. But this is not just the prelude to fiction. This is folklore with teeth. The Strigoi is not bound by castle walls or noble curses. It is a creature of the people. Its story, passed by whisper, not printing press. And it carries something raw that Gothic literature often forgets. This is not about eternal life. This is about what happens when death goes wrong. In Romanian villages, belief in the Strigoi was not a metaphor. It was practical, concrete. Entire rituals were developed to prevent its return: coin offerings, garlic wreaths, holy water. And when those failed, stronger measures were taken. There are documented cases, real historical records, of grave exhumations well into the 20th century. These were not isolated acts of madness. They were communal events witnessed and approved. Because everyone feared the alternative: better to disturb the grave than let the grave disturb you. The line between life and death has always been fragile. But in the Carpathians it was porous. Spirits walked among the living. The dead could speak. And not all who walked were at peace. In the next part, we'll descend deeper into this world, into the specific beliefs, rituals, and blood-stained truths of rural Romania. We'll meet the villagers who lived with the Strigoi, the priests who battled them, and the ancient warnings carved into wood and stone. But for now, remember this. Before Dracula became legend, the Strigoi was real. The second time they dug him up, the heart was still warm. That's what the story says. Passed down from old women in the hills of Transylvania, whispered in the smoky kitchens of shepherds, and stitched into the silence between winter winds. He had died young. Too young. A sickness, they said. But sickness does not leave footprints. And after they buried him, the dogs stopped barking. The cows refused to give milk. A child woke screaming with scratches down her chest. A grandmother found blood on the windowsill. So they went to the grave, and what they found was a body too red, too fresh. So they took the heart, burned it, said prayers, waited. But the child cried again. The animals still panicked. The air remained thick with dread. So they returned. And the second time, they say the heart was still warm. Welcome to the reality of Strigoi. In the villages of Romania, death is not a single moment. It is a negotiation, a process, a liminal space where the dead are not yet fully gone and the living are not yet safe. This belief gives rise to an entire system of rituals, signs, and sacred acts designed to ensure the boundary between life and death holds firm. Because when it doesn't, Strigoi, let us begin with death. When a person dies, there is no rushing the burial. The body is watched constantly for at least 3 days. This is not only mourning, it is surveillance. If the corpse shifts, groans, bleeds, or refuses to stiffen, the watchers know something is wrong. Mirrors are covered, animals are kept away, salt is placed in the corners of the room. These actions are not just symbolic, they are preventative. Because a soul that sees itself in a mirror might refuse to leave. Because a cat jumping over the body can reanimate it. Because salt purifies the threshold between worlds. After burial, the real test begins. In the days and weeks that follow, villagers observe closely for signs. Are family members becoming ill without cause? Are animals avoiding the home? Are dreams becoming too vivid, too disturbing? Has a child begun to speak in voices not their own? These are not coincidences, they are warnings. If the signs multiply, the family must act. First, they consult a wise woman or a baba. She knows the herbs, the prayers, the patterns of death. She may perform a divination using wax or bones. She may visit the grave herself. If suspicion is confirmed, the body is exhumed. Not by strangers, by the family. Sometimes the entire village comes to watch. This is not hysteria. This is duty. And when they open the coffin, they look for signs. Is the body unusually well preserved? Is there blood at the lips? Have the nails and hair grown? If even one sign is present, the ritual begins. A stake of iron or hawthorn may be driven through the chest. Garlic placed in the mouth and ears. The body burned and the ashes scattered. In some cases, the heart alone is removed and burned separately, then mixed with water and given to afflicted family members to drink. This is not an act of cruelty, it is medicine. Strigoi, after all, do not just haunt. They infect. They poison life at the root. And to stop them, one must understand their nature. A Strigoi is not always evil. Sometimes it is a soul that died too soon, too violently. A child unbaptized, a person betrayed, a life cut off before its time. The dead cling to the world when the world has not finished with them. In some villages, they believe the Strigoi is not even aware it is dead. It wanders home, confused, hungry, drawn to the life it once knew. This is why offerings are sometimes left at the grave, bread, salt, wine. A way to satisfy the hunger, to ease the transition. But when that fails intervention, stories abound of families torn apart not just by fear, but by disagreement. A mother refusing to let her son be exhumed. A sister insisting her brother would never return like that. But the signs are relentless, and the village cannot wait. Because every moment lost is a door opened wider. In some cases, the Strigoi does not attack at night, but in dreams. It presses upon the chest. It whispers ancient griefs. It plants sickness like seeds. And the only cure is truth. To face the body, to name the wound, to end the hunger. And so they dig, they burn, they remember. Romanian folklore is not quiet. It is full of cries of flames, of prayers shouted into the dark. It is not afraid to disturb the grave if that's what peace requires. And in this, it holds a kind of wisdom we have forgotten. That not all rest is peaceful, that some dead carry their pain with them, and that sometimes to heal the living we must first face the restless dead. To understand the Strigoi, we must follow their shadow into the past, not into myth, but into history. Because Strigoi are not just creatures of folklore. They are witnesses to centuries of fear, control, and belief. And as the Middle Ages swept across Europe, those fears sharpened into laws, into fires, into trials. This is where the dead met the church. In the 15th and 16th centuries, as plagues devastated the continent and religious power centralized the boundaries between folklore medicine and theology began to blur. What had once been the domain of grandmothers and midwives now came under the eye of bishops and judges. The body became sacred property, and death, once a community affair, became institutionalized. But still, the dead refused to rest, and people, especially in remote areas like the Carpathians, continued to trust the old ways. Historical records exist, some dry and legal, others drenched in desperation, of communities taking action against the suspected Strigoi. These are not fairy tales. These are written in ink and archived in churches and libraries. One account from 1579 details a case in a small Transylvanian village, where a series of unexplained deaths led the villagers to exhume a woman who had died the month before. Her body was bloated with fresh blood at her mouth. The villagers, led by the local priest, burned her corpse and scattered her ashes at the riverbank. The death stopped. No trial, no court, just ritual and silence. But not all cases ended quietly. As belief in Strigoi intersected with the European witch craze, suspicion turned deadly. Women, especially healers, midwives, and widows, were increasingly targeted, not just as witches, but as living Strigoi. In some Romanian villages, a woman who lived alone, who brewed herbs, who spoke to the wind, might be labeled Strigoica, the female form. It didn't matter if she helped birth your child last year. It didn't matter that she warned you of bad omens. What mattered was fear, and once fear takes root, it grows fast. In a 1612 trial in Wallachia, court transcripts describe a woman accused of feeding off the life of her neighbors while they slept. No physical evidence was needed, just dreams, testimonies of nightmares, and a few miscarried pregnancies. She was sentenced to death, not because she was proven guilty, but because the village needed peace. This is the tragic intersection of folklore and justice, when story becomes accusation and belief becomes execution. But the Strigoi were not always blamed on women. Men, too, could be accused, especially if they had been cruel in life or died unbaptized. The absence of a Christian burial was a dangerous omission. In the eyes of the church, a soul that was not properly guided into the afterlife was vulnerable to possession. In the eyes of the people, it became a threat. One of the most chilling records comes from 1725 in Kisilova, a Serbian village just south of the Carpathian Range. There, a man named Petar Plogojevic died suddenly. Within days, 9 others followed, each claiming to have seen him in the night. When authorities investigated, they found his body undecomposed with fresh blood on his lips. The villagers insisted on driving a stake through his heart, which reportedly caused the body to bleed and groan. This event, documented in official Austrian reports, is considered by some scholars as one of the earliest recorded vampire panics in Europe. But make no mistake, this wasn't Dracula. This was Strigoi. And unlike Dracula, who wears his monstrosity with aristocratic flair, the Strigoi's horror is that it was once human, that it is still too human, that it carries the scent of your neighbor's clothes, the sound of your brother's laugh, the hunger of a life cut short. Even when the Enlightenment began to rise, bringing science and skepticism to the fore, belief in Strigoi endured. Medical students in the 18th century wrote dissertations trying to explain vampire bodies, using natural causes, disease, premature burial, the effect of soil and temperature on decomposition. But in the mountains, stories didn't need science. They needed memory. They needed survival. Because when your child wakes with bruises on her neck and no one can explain it, the question isn't what science says. It's what the old ones warned you. It's what your grandmother whispered as she scattered salt across the windowsill. The historical Strigoi is a mirror, not just of the supernatural, but of the human need for cause. for blame, for protection in a world that often offers none. And it's here in these records and rituals that the true horror lives, that the Strigoi might not be evil, that it might just be forgotten, abandoned, unnamed, unburied in some spiritual way, left behind by the very people it loved. In many ways, the Strigoi embodies the consequences of neglect of the dead, yes, but also of grief, of failing to mourn properly, of silence after death when there should have been song, of fear where there should have been memory. And in that silence, something stirs. In the next part, we'll leave the courts and archives and step into the myths again, into the physical manifestations of Strigoi, the tales of transformation and the signs of their approach. We'll meet the protective talismans, the forbidden rituals, and the nightmares passed from mother to child across centuries. But as we move deeper, remember, this is not just a story of monsters. This is a story of those we couldn't let go, and those who couldn't let go of us. You do not see the Strigoi at first. You feel it, in the way the wind changes near your window, in the chill that seeps through closed doors, in the silence of the animals, in the way your own breath catches when you say their name out loud. Strigoi do not announce themselves. They return quietly, slipping between memory and flesh, grief and hunger. And when they come, they do not always look like monsters, because the Strigoi still wears the face it had in life. In Romanian folklore, the Strigoi is both a specter and a shadow of the person it once was. Its most terrifying quality isn't its monstrousness, it's its familiarity. It can return wearing the exact face of your dead brother, your lost daughter, your neighbor who passed suddenly in winter. At first, it may seem unchanged, just quieter, hungrier. It watches from the tree line. It lingers near the barn. It knocks at the window late at night, calling softly in the voice of someone you miss. Many legends say the Strigoi only grows monstrous over time. As its hunger deepens, so too does its corruption. Its skin turns pale or reddish, bloated, like a drowned body. Its nails darken, its eyes hollow. The smile, if it smiles, is stretched too wide. Always too wide. But until that transformation is complete, its greatest weapon is deception. This is why so many stories involve children and the elderly, those most likely to be dismissed or least able to defend themselves. A child may wake claiming to have seen their deceased grandmother hovering above their crib. An old man might whisper that his dead wife came to him again, smelling of earth and lavender. Most people refuse to believe them, until it's too late. There are signs, though, and they matter. A sudden drop in temperature, even in summer, restless livestock or pets refusing to enter a room, the scent of decay, or wet soil with no visible source. Dreams shared by multiple people in the same household. When these warnings align, villagers turn to protective measures passed down for generations. Garlic is the most famous, hung in doorways, rubbed on windowsills, stuffed into pockets, and even into the mouths of corpses. But it's far from the only defense. Salt is sacred. It's placed in shoes, around beds, across thresholds. Some families sleep with iron under their pillows, a nail, a horseshoe, a scythe blade. Iron, cold forged, is said to ground the soul and keep spirits from crossing. A more obscure tradition involves red thread tied around the wrist of a newborn. This protects the child from being marked by the Strigoi during its first vulnerable days. In some villages, even mirrors are removed from homes during funerals to prevent souls from being trapped or confused by their reflection. There are also chants, old ones, rarely written down, passed from grandmother to granddaughter. Protective prayers stitched into lullabies. Curse breakers whispered during eclipses. And always the candles. One must never let the flame go out at a death vigil. The light is what guides the soul. Without it, the path back is too easy. Sometimes, despite all this, the Strigoi returns. That's when you turn to the earth itself. The grave of a suspected Strigoi may be marked with thorn branches or pierced with iron stakes. Some families place coins or beans in the coffin, odd numbers only to occupy the spirit and keep it from wandering. In rare cases, a corpse may be turned face down or bound with ropes to confuse its orientation underground. If the signs persist, if illness spreads, if dreams intensify, the family must seek intervention. This can take the form of a ritual known as diskantek, a spiritual unbinding. A baba or wise woman will enter the home, often barefoot, and perform a cleansing using smoke herbs and whispered words. If successful, the spirit may be calmed. If not, the body must be exhumed. What happens next varies by region, but the goal is always the same: to sever the tether. Some stories say the heart must be pierced with a rose thorn stake. Others demand it be removed entirely and burned in sacred fire. In one version from Bukovina, the ashes are mixed with wine and shared among the afflicted family, an act both purifying and horrifying. But the most curious thing, none of this is viewed with hatred. The Strigoi is not treated like a demon to be destroyed. It is treated like a soul that's lost its way. And that's the tragedy. Because at the heart of the Strigoi legend lies grief, longing, the ache of absence. These are not monsters from foreign lands. They are our dead, our loved ones. And it's that closeness, the idea that death may not have finished its business, that haunts people most. One story tells of a mother whose infant died in winter. She sang lullabies to the snow every night. Then, weeks later, she found tiny prints in the frost leading to her door. No one else believed her until the village's water turned red with blood, and livestock began dying. They unearthed the child's grave. The coffin was empty. Another tale speaks of a bride who died on her wedding night. Her groom swore he saw her walking through the orchard weeks later, wearing the same dress. When they opened her grave, it was filled with mud, but no body. Even in silence, the Strigoi speaks. Even in dreams, it walks. Even now, many villagers will not say the word after dark. They'll call it the hungry one or the nightkin, because names hold power. And when you name something, you risk calling it forth. In the next part, we'll travel deeper into the mountains where the oldest stories hide. We'll meet those who still practice the old ways, who still burn herbs under new moons, who still hang garlic, not for tourists, but for survival. But remember, before we go, the Strigoi does not knock to be let in. It knocks to remind you it was never truly gone. There are places in the Carpathian Mountains where time has slowed to a whisper. Villages cloaked in fog, unreachable by road for half the year. Wooden crosses lean under centuries of wind, and the bells of small churches echo like heartbeat across the valley. Here, the Strigoi is not a tale. It is a neighbor, a warning, a memory that still breathes. We've arrived at the living roots of the legend. In these remote villages, oral tradition has preserved what books and scholars could not. The people here still remember not the monsters, but the methods. They do not speak of the Strigoi lightly, but when they do, it is with a reverence usually reserved for saints or curses. We visited one such village where the elder, an 83-year-old woman named Ioana, sat wrapped in wool, her eyes clear as mountain ice. She spoke of her mother's warnings of herbs gathered before dawn, of children kept indoors during the red moon. The Strigoi, she said, comes when we forget how to care for the dead. It comes when grief turns to hunger. Her words were echoed by others, farmers, shepherds, even the village priest. They did not dismiss the old beliefs. Instead, they layered them atop Christian ritual, creating a hybrid spirituality, both resilient and strange. In one home, we were shown a bundle, tied with red string, a piece of garlic, a silver coin, a dried flower, and 3 human hairs. It was buried beneath the threshold during the birth of a child, meant to keep wandering souls from entering. In another, we saw a room where no one slept. It had been the bedroom of a grandfather who died during Lent, a dangerous time to die, they said, because the veil between worlds was thin. The family lit a candle there every night, even 70 years later. Outsiders might call it superstition, but here it is memory. It is protection. It is love in the form of fear. What's remarkable is not just the persistence of these beliefs, but how adaptable they are. In one village, a young woman named Anna had created a TikTok channel where she shared local ghost stories and Strigoi legends. She wore traditional clothing, translated chants into English, and spoke to an audience far beyond the mountains. And yet she refused to film at night. There are still rules, she told us. Some things you don't provoke. Even modern technology hasn't erased the weight of tradition. Smartphones may now carry the stories, but the content remains unchanged. Salt, silence. Songs whispered on the wind. One evening, we were invited to witness a ritual called Paza de Mormont, the guarding of a grave. A young man had died unexpectedly in a nearby village, and the family feared unrest in his spirit. For 3 nights, they took turns watching the grave, lighting candles, placing fresh flowers, and reading psalms. No one spoke above a whisper. No one turned their back to the woods. On the 3rd night, a dog began howling. The candles flickered, and an older woman leaned in and quietly scattered salt in 4 directions. This was not theater. This was not performance. This was belief made flesh. There is a saying in these villages, better a full grave than a hungry spirit. And so they feed the dead with prayers, with light, with memory. Because forgetting that is what awakens the Strigoi. Not evil, not magic, neglect. And perhaps that is what makes this story so human. We fear not just death, but being forgotten. And in fearing that, we make space for legends that remind us how thin the veil really is. Another elder named Nikolai told us of a story from 1932. A boy drowned in spring and was buried quickly before the thaw finished. Weeks later, children reported seeing someone their age standing by the riverbank at dusk, silent, unmoving. The sightings grew. Then came the sickness. 3 children died. Within days, fevers, seizures, strange scratches on their necks. The villagers finally exhumed the boy's body. He had turned in his grave, they said. His eyes were open. He was reburied, face down, mouth sewn shut, iron sickle across his chest. No more deaths followed. These aren't fictions. These are memories passed like heirlooms. True or not, they shape behavior. They explain what science cannot. And they remind people that the living and the dead are closer than we admit. We asked Ioana if she had ever seen a Strigoi herself. She paused, then said, "I saw my brother 3 weeks after his funeral. He stood in the field beside the scarecrow. He looked confused, like he didn't know where he was. I lit 3 candles and whispered our mother's name. He vanished, but I never doubted it was him." Before we left, she pressed a bundle of dried basil and wormwood into our hands. "For your doorstep," she said, "just in case." And we took it, not because we believed, but because we weren't sure we didn't. In the next part, we'll explore how stories like these began to change how they crossed borders, entered books, and eventually bled into the myth of Dracula. We'll look at how the Strigoi was transformed from spirit to aristocrat, from rural shadow to Gothic icon. But as we leave the Carpathians, remember this. Not every monster is born from evil. Some are born from memory, some from love, and some from the simple fear that we might be left behind. By the late 17th century, whispers of the Strigoi had drifted beyond the Carpathian hills. No longer just a village secret or the echo of a mother's prayer, the creature began its slow transformation, leaving behind the dirt paths and wooden crosses of Romanian folklore and entering the marble halls of Enlightenment Europe. And what they saw, they did not understand, because they were not looking at a ghost. They were looking at a mirror. This is how the Strigoi became a monster the world would never forget. It began, as many things did, in the 1700s with panic. Across the Austro-Hungarian Empire, reports emerged of corpses refusing to stay buried. Entire villages claimed the dead were rising, walking at night, attacking livestock, spreading disease. Some bodies were exhumed and found to be bloated, red-faced, or clutching their own shrouds. The people had no doubt these were Strigoi. But the imperial authorities didn't have that word, so they used another vampire. One of the earliest documented cases was in Serbia in 1725, where a man named Petar Blagojevic was believed to have returned from the grave after dying suddenly. 9 villagers died within a week, all claiming to have seen Petar in their dreams. When officials opened his grave, they claimed his body was incorrupt, with fresh blood on his lips. The corpse was staked through the heart and burned. The tale exploded across Europe. Writers, theologians, and physicians argued in newspapers and pamphlets. Some dismissed the stories as peasant hysteria. Others treated them as serious theological crises. The Catholic Church in particular grew concerned that belief in undead spirits was undermining Christian doctrine about the soul's journey after death. But the public couldn't look away. These vampire panics spread like wildfire. In places like Moravia, Silesia, and Transylvania, every unexplained illness or sudden death risked being blamed on the recently deceased. Graves were desecrated. Families were shunned. Fear became contagious. Meanwhile, back in Romania, the word Strigoi was still whispered at night. But now, its shape was being warped. The foreign world wasn't interested in the ritual, the grief, or the nuanced humanity of the legend. It wanted fangs. It wanted blood. It wanted spectacle. In 1819, John Polidori published The Vampire, creating a new archetype, the vampire, as a seductive, aristocratic predator. His monster was not a grieving spirit, but a cold, calculating man with charm and title. This figure would inspire countless imitators across Gothic literature, but none would surpass Bram Stoker. When Stoker published Dracula in 1897, he fused European vampire hysteria with scraps of Romanian history. He had never visited Transylvania, but he read books, memoirs from travelers, church records, newspaper clippings. He learned the name Vlad Țepeș, the real-life Wallachian prince known for impaling his enemies. But Vlad was no vampire. Stoker borrowed the name Dracula from Vlad's historical title, Son of the Dragon, and layered it with fiction. His Dracula was a nobleman who lived in a crumbling castle, who drank blood-controlled wolves and seduced women. He was ancient, powerful, foreign, and terrifying, and nothing like the Strigoi. But the transformation was complete. The vampire had become a literary icon. Gone was the rural ritual, the songs, the salt, the grandmother's whispers. In their place stood an English horror novel that cast the Carpathians as exotic, cursed, and unknowable. Dracula wasn't just a monster. He was a colonial metaphor, a fear of the East encroaching on the West. Western audiences devoured the story. Soon, Dracula appeared in theater, then in silent film, then in black and white horror classics. The vampire's face changed with each generation, from Nosferatu's ghastly rat-like features, to Bela Lugosi's suave tuxedo, to Anne Rice's tormented immortals, and Twilight's glittering brooding youth. But the Strigoi, it faded. The original folklore became a footnote, something anthropologists studied but few people remembered. The rituals remained in remote villages, but the world had moved on. And yet the Strigoi never truly vanished. Even as the vampire became a pop culture phenomenon, Romanian villagers continued to tell their stories. Some still practiced grave watch. Some still placed garlic in the rafters. And every now and then, a report would surface, a body exhumed, a heart burned, an old belief rekindled by sudden tragedy. One such case occurred in 2004 in the village of Marotinu de Sus. A man named Petre Toma died and was buried, but his niece claimed she saw him in her dreams, pale and silent night after night. Villagers, terrified, dug up his grave, removed his heart, burned it, and mixed the ashes with water to drink. The Romanian government prosecuted them for disturbing the dead, but locals defended the act as necessary, as tradition, as survival. The story made international headlines. Modern vampire slaying, they called it. But it wasn't modern, it was ancient, it was Strigoi. And not all Romanians embraced Dracula. Some scholars, priests, and villagers resented how their traditions had been twisted into Western myths. They argued that Dracula was an outsider's fantasy, imposed on a rich spiritual heritage. The Church condemned the glamorization of vampires, while folklorists called for a return to the Strigoi's deeper cultural roots. This was the cycle: belief suppressed, transformed, then resurrected. Each time the world tried to bury the Strigoi, something, grief, fear, memory, dug it back up. And perhaps that's the lesson. The West turned the Strigoi into a monster. Romania kept it as a memory. One asked what it could sell. The other asked what it meant. And in that divide lies the difference between horror and folklore, between spectacle and soul. In the next part, we'll look deeper into the real Vlad Tepes, his wars, his cruelties, and how he became inseparably bound to a myth he never asked for. We'll uncover how his historical brutality was twisted into the symbol of supernatural evil, and why even Romanians remain divided over his legacy. But before we go, the vampire we know is not the vampire we came from. The original creature was not in a castle. It was in a field, wearing your father's face, calling you home. Before he was Dracula, he was Vlad. Not a vampire, not a count, but a prince raised on betrayal, sharpened by war, and remembered for the forest of corpses he left in his wake. Vlad Tepes the Impaler. This is the man behind the myth. And what we find is not a monster born of bloodlust, but a ruler forged in chaos, cruelty, and impossible choices. Let us unmask him. Vlad was born in 1431 in the fortress town of Sighișoara in Transylvania. His father, Vlad II, Dracula, was a member of the Order of the Dragon, a Christian knighthood formed to defend Europe against the Ottomans. The name Dracula came from the Latin Draco, meaning dragon. Vlad's later moniker Dracula simply meant son of the dragon. But dragons in those days did not breathe fire, they bled loyalty. And loyalty in 15th century Wallachia was fragile at best. In 1442, Vlad and his younger brother Radu were taken as political hostages by the Ottoman Empire. They were just boys. Their father had promised allegiance to the Sultan, and the price was his sons. While Radu adapted to life at the Ottoman court, Vlad seethed. He learned Turkish swordplay and diplomacy, but never forgot he was a prisoner. That bitterness, nurtured in marble halls and gilded cages, would one day fuel his reign. When he was released, Wallachia was in chaos. His father had been assassinated, his older brother buried alive. The throne passed between rivals like a poisoned chalice. Vlad seized it in 1456. What followed was one of the most brutal and strangely effective reigns in Eastern European history. To secure power, Vlad used terror. He impaled boyars who had betrayed his father. He executed entire families to wipe out treachery at the root. He didn't just punish enemies, he made examples of them. According to chroniclers, Vlad impaled tens of thousands. Men, women, even children. Stakes were sharpened, and oiled victims hoisted by their own weight until the poles pierced through their bodies. The forests of corpses served as warnings, gruesome signs that order had returned. Western envoys called him a madman, but many Romanians called him savior, because for the first time in decades there was law. Bandits disappeared. Corruption ceased. Merchants traveled without fear. The peasants, though, terrified, knew justice was swift and consistent. Then came the Ottomans. In 1462, Sultan Mehmed II, fresh from conquering Constantinople, marched on Wallachia with an army over 100,000 strong. Vlad had few allies, no resources, but he had fear. He employed scorched earth tactics, poisoned wells, burned villages, released plague victims into Ottoman camps. And then the forest of the impaled. When the Sultan approached Dragoviste, he found 20,000 Turkish corpses mounted on stakes outside the city. The stench turned stomachs. Even Mehmed, one of the most ruthless conquerors in history, was reportedly shaken. He withdrew. Vlad had won without a battle. But peace was temporary. His brother Radu, now allied with the Ottomans, returned with fresh support. Vlad was forced to flee, captured by the Hungarians, and imprisoned for over a decade. When he returned to power briefly in 1476, it was only to die shortly after, ambushed in the mountains, decapitated. His head was sent to the Sultan in Constantinople. And that should have been the end, but it wasn't. Even in death, Vlad refused to fade. Stories of his cruelty spread across Europe, mixed with whispers of dark magic. German pamphlets painted him as a demon. Russian tales told of his unflinching discipline. Hungarian writers turned him into a cautionary ghost. Then came Bram Stoker. Stoker never mentioned Vlad's impalements in his novel. He likely knew little of the real man, but he found the name Dracula in an old history book and borrowed it, knowing the exotic blood-stained weight it carried. And so, Vlad the Impaler became Count Dracula, a man of stakes and swords reborn as a creature of fangs and cloaks. But in Romania, the memory is more complicated. To many, Vlad is a national hero, a symbol of resistance against Turkish domination. His cruelty is acknowledged but contextualized. After all, he lived in a time when impalement was not rare, when rulers had to terrify to survive. Others reject his sanctification. They point to the innocent lives lost, the villages razed, the psychological scars, etched into oral history. They question how far brutality should be forgiven in the name of sovereignty. The debate continues. There are schools named after Vlad, statues, tourist shops selling Dracula mugs. But in quiet corners, some elders still light candles for the souls he sent screaming into the earth. And perhaps that is what makes Vlad so enduring. He is not a figure to be loved or hated. He is a figure to be reckoned with. A mirror for power, what it demands, what it breaks, and what it leaves behind. In the next part, we'll explore how Vlad's image evolved during communist Romania, how propaganda reshaped him into a secular saint, and how the West's vampire collided with the East's patriot in a strange cultural tug-of-war. But before we leave him behind, remember, Vlad Țepeș did not drink blood. He spilled it. With precision, with purpose, and with a silence that still echoes in the pine forests of Wallachia. History is not what happened. It's what we choose to remember. And in 20th century Romania, that choice was political. As vampires haunted Western cinema screens, the Romanian state was building statues. As children in America dressed like Dracula, schoolchildren in Bucharest learned of a national savior. This is the story of how Vlad Țepeș became a weapon of ideology, a ghost raised not by grief or legend but by propaganda. When the Iron Curtain fell across Eastern Europe, history was rewritten not by monks or poets, but by bureaucrats. In the Romanian People's Republic, founded in 1947, the Communist Party sought to consolidate power not only over people but over memory. They needed heroes, symbols, icons untouched by capitalist or religious stain. And so they turned to Vlad. It began subtly. School curricula included lessons on Vlad Țepeș as a patriotic ruler who fought against corruption and foreign invaders. His brutality was rebranded as strength. His impalements, once a symbol of terror, were reframed as justice in an age of betrayal. By the 1960s, under the leadership of Nicolae Ceausescu, the rehabilitation intensified. Vlad was lionized in state-approved history books as a proto-communist, a ruler of the people who punished the greedy elites. His fierce independence from both the Catholic West and the Islamic East was recast as a model for Romanian sovereignty. Posters of Vlad appeared in classrooms. Statues were restored. Films were commissioned showing him, not as a savage tyrant, but a noble protector of the Romanian identity. The Church, once an enemy, now cautiously aligned its messaging with the state, emphasizing his defense of orthodoxy. It was a paradoxical resurrection. The regime that outlawed superstition and religion now venerated a man born of myth. But they controlled the narrative. The Vlad they gave the people was secular, sanitized and weaponized. Meanwhile, the Western world had embraced a different Vlad entirely. Count Dracula had evolved into a cultural juggernaut. From the silver screen to comic books to cereal boxes, he became a caricature cloak, Fang's accent. He was feared, adored, parodied, rarely questioned. The dissonance grew sharper. In the East, Vlad was taught as a martyr of national pride. In the West, he was a monster of appetite. The Cold War made it worse. As American tourists came to Romania seeking Dracula's castle, local guides gritted their teeth. There was no real castle, no coffin, no bat-filled crypt. And yet the economy welcomed the myth even as historians cringed. In 1972, the Romanian government launched a bizarre cultural project, the Dracula tourism circuit. Hotels were built, signs erected. The fictional narrative of Dracula was reluctantly embraced for its capitalist potential. Ceausescu walked a tightrope denouncing the vampire legend while cashing in on the foreign obsession with it. Ironically, both versions, Vlad the hero and Dracula the vampire, were untrue. The real man lay buried somewhere beneath centuries of manipulation. But not everyone forgot. In the quiet corners of Romania, away from the cameras and monuments, some villagers still whispered the old stories. Not of Dracula, not even of Vlad, but of the Strigoi. The idea persisted that there were still souls who wandered, still rites that must be observed, still nights when dogs howled too long and fires refused to catch. And it was here, in this space between state and story, that a third version of Vlad emerged. To some, he was all three: the ruler, the monster, the ghost. Folklorists began to document the inconsistencies. Local legends told of Vlad's spirit roaming certain forests. Some believed his cruelty had bound him to this world, that he had become, in essence, a Strigoi neither honored nor at rest. It was a narrative the regime could not control. By the 1980s, Romania was crumbling under debt paranoia and censorship. Ceausescu's grip tightened. His propaganda became more desperate, and yet even then, his favorite historical figure remained Vlad. Shortly before his fall, Ceausescu reportedly commissioned a massive monument to Vlad, meant to rival any statue in the West. It was never completed. In 1989, the revolution came. The dictator was executed. The archives opened. What followed was a renaissance of memory. Romanians began to reclaim their history, not as dogma, but as inquiry. New books emerged. Old manuscripts resurfaced. Scholars dissected the propaganda, compared it to Western mythology, and sought the man lost in between. Some found contradictions. Why had the Ottomans kept records of Vlad's tactics, but not of his supposed vampirism? Why had Stoker never mentioned impalement? Why did the Strigoi disappear from state folklore even as Dracula exploded globally? These questions didn't destroy the myth, they enriched it. Because in the end, the truth was never simple. Vlad was neither saint nor devil. Dracula was neither pure fiction nor borrowed history. They were echoes of each other, twins separated by time and agenda. And for modern Romania, that duality became strangely liberating. No longer forced to choose between hero and monster, many Romanians began to embrace the ambiguity. Cultural festivals now feature both Vlad and Dracula. Universities offer courses that explore vampirism as metaphor. Artists reinterpret the legends with irony, reverence, and rebellion. And in one village we visited, a school teacher told her students, "Vlad was like a mirror. He showed us who we feared and who we wished we could be." One such example is the annual Festival of Medieval Arts and Crafts in Sighișoara, Vlad's birthplace, where tourists flock to see reenactments, wear cloaks, and walk candlelit tours through the citadel. What was once a contested legacy has become a shared performance. Even hotels now sell authentic Dracula experiences, while local historians offer walking lectures to correct misconceptions. Rather than reject the myth, many Romanians have learned to dance with it, turning centuries of confusion into a strange kind of cultural harmony. In the next part, we'll explore the modern resurrection of vampire folklore, how Strigoi have re-emerged in contemporary storytelling art, and even social media. We'll look at how ancient fears are finding new voices, and why some believe the monster never left, only adapted. But for now, we close this chapter, where the dead were used to serve the living, where ideology wore a cape, and where memory became myth by design. Legends don't die. They migrate, they adapt, and sometimes they log in. In the 21st century, the Strigoi has begun to stir again, but not in forests or graveyards, in books, in games, in forums, in the flicker of a screen. The monster has returned, but this time it's not alone. This is the story of how the Strigoi came back, not just as a myth, but as a metaphor. Today, the Strigoi is everywhere and nowhere. You won't find it in a dusty village chronicle or whispered beside a hearth. Instead, you'll see it in graphic novels and indie horror films. You'll hear it in podcasts dissecting obscure folklore. You'll scroll past it in Reddit threads titled True Encounters or Things My Grandmother Told Me. But make no mistake, it's the same creature. It just learned how to trend. In recent years, there has been a resurgence of interest in local mythologies, especially in Eastern Europe. From Slavic forest spirits to Baltic death omens, creators and scholars alike are reclaiming stories long dismissed as superstition. For Romanians, the Strigoi has become a central figure in this folkloric revival. Part of this is cultural pride. Young Romanians disillusioned by globalization and digital sameness have begun exploring the mysteries of their own roots. They share stories in both English and Romanian. They organize panels at comic conventions about undead archetypes. Some even write their own novels replacing generic vampires with something older, stranger, and more tragic. But it's not just artists. Psychologists have noted the rising presence of Strigoi-like archetypes in therapy sessions, particularly among diaspora communities. In these contexts, the undead is no longer a literal corpse, but a metaphor for unresolved trauma, for ancestral pain, for the past refusing to rest. The Strigoi then has become a symbol. It's the voice that haunts second-generation immigrants when they forget a language. It's the weight of shame passed through generations. It's the silent guilt that lives in the bones of families fractured by war, dictatorship, or exile. This is not horror, it's healing. Meanwhile, the entertainment world has caught on. Netflix series set in Eastern Europe are now adding Strigoi references with increasing frequency. Video games like the Witcher franchise borrow liberally from Romanian and Slavic folklore, mixing Strigoi lore with broader undead narratives. YouTube channels analyze the differences between vampires and Strigoi, racking up millions of views. And on TikTok, perhaps the strangest development yet, creators share makeup tutorials on how to look like a Strigoi. Others post short horror skits filmed in misty woods with captions like POV, "You're the last of your village," and "Something's calling your name at midnight." Even the Romanian government, seeing the opportunity, has quietly supported heritage-based tourism, centered not just around Dracula, but around the older myths. Villages that once feared being ridiculed for their beliefs now find themselves visited by filmmakers and documentarians. But the return of the Strigoi isn't only a cultural moment. It's also a reckoning, because many of the old fears still remain. In rural parts of Romania, grave watch rituals still occur. Garlic is still hung in rafters. Some families still place coins in the mouths of the dead. When asked why, villagers don't say because of vampires. They say, it's what we've always done. And underneath that answer lies centuries of memory. To some, this is just folklore, a charming relic. But to others, it's a living system. A way of understanding the world when logic fails. When grief returns like a whisper. When the dead appear in dreams and waking up doesn't shake the feeling. The Strigoi endures because it was never about blood. It was about absence. About the space someone leaves behind when they die. And what happens when that space is never properly honored. Even academics are revisiting old texts. Some scholars now argue that Strigoi beliefs represent an early form of mental health awareness, a way for pre-modern communities to process trauma, especially in times of plague, war, or famine. The rituals they suggest provided structure, control, a narrative for grief. In this light, burning a heart wasn't just superstition, it was therapy. And so the monster returns not as a villain but as a vessel. In modern Romanian literature, new Strigoi characters appear as mourners, protectors, even reluctant prophets. No longer grotesque, they are tragic, bound to the world, because they loved it too much to leave. Artists depict them not with fangs, but with sorrowful eyes and outstretched hands. This reimagining isn't a betrayal of the legend, it's a homecoming. Because before Dracula turned the undead into predators, they were reflections of hunger, of loneliness, of the invisible weights we carry through generations. And perhaps this is why, in a world saturated with horror tropes, the Strigoi still feels original, still feels personal. Because it doesn't come for you, it waits for you to come home. One researcher, Dr. Elena Popescu, spent 3 years living in remote villages in Maramuresh to observe the traditions firsthand. She was present during a winter funeral, where after the body was buried, the family invited neighbors to a meal, where no mirrors were uncovered and every shadow was respected. They didn't call it Strigoi, she noted. They called it ensuring rest. But the meaning was the same. Don't let grief rot. Don't let silence grow teeth. In another village, she witnessed a watch night, where young men kept vigil at a gravesite for 3 days. They told stories, sang hymns, and most poignantly, told jokes the deceased once loved. If you ask them why, they'd shrug. So he doesn't feel alone. This blending of reverence and realism speaks to the true power of the Strigoi. It's not that people believe in monsters. It's that they remember being haunted by things left undone. Modern authors and filmmakers are learning from this. Rather than depict vampires as violent parasites, they show Strigoi as metaphors for memory. In one recent Romanian short film, a young woman returns home after her father's death, only to find his ghost, asking questions no one dared speak in life. It's not horror, it's healing through haunting. And perhaps that's the most honest ending a legend can have. It grows, it returns, it listens. So when we say the Strigoi has come back, maybe we should ask, did it ever leave? In the next part, the final part, we will return to where we began. We'll examine why the Strigoi matters today, what its evolution tells us about how we remember, and why some stories refuse to fade even after death. But before that, let us ask, when we bury the dead, what do we expect them to take with them? And what happens when they don't? Some stories do not end, they wait. They wait in bloodlines and lullabies, in shadows and songs, in the silence between questions we never ask. The Strigoi is one of those stories. In this final part, we ask, why do we keep resurrecting this tale? And what does it want from us now? We've followed the Strigoi from the ash of medieval fires to the glow of smartphone screens. We've seen how fear and memory dance across centuries, how rituals were born not of fiction, but of grief, how myths protected the living more than they condemned the dead. But why does this myth still follow us? Perhaps it's because the Strigoi, unlike most monsters, doesn't want to destroy us. It wants to be understood. In a world obsessed with beginnings and endings, the Strigoi reminds us of what lies in between the unresolved, the unspoken, the things we don't bury properly. Not just people, but feelings, truths, responsibilities. The Strigoi asks uncomfortable questions. What guilt have we inherited? What rage have we silenced? What grief have we disguised as strength? And in doing so, it becomes less of a monster and more of a mirror. In the West, we often treat death as a door, final, clean. We close it with prayers, plaques, and polite eulogies. But in many parts of Romania, death remains porous. The veil never fully seals. And the stories we tell reflect that porousness, not as superstition, but as a form of honesty. The Strigoi doesn't appear because someone died. It appears because someone wasn't remembered right. And so we light candles. We retell their names. We sweep their graves. We tell stories not just to entertain, but to keep something warm that the cold earth cannot. In this way, folklore is not just a tool of the past. It's a promise. We will not let you fade, and yet, fade we do. Stories dissolve. Languages thin. Graves erode. Every generation moves further from the silence that birthed its myths. And so new myths must emerge not to replace the old ones, but to ask new versions of the same questions. Who are we without memory? What do we owe the ones who came before? Can a story die if someone still feels it? One of the most haunting things we encountered in our research wasn't a grave or a tale, but a child. A young boy in Bistrica, no older than 10, who overheard an interview and quietly said, "Oh, my grandma says the Strigoi walk through dreams when you forget them." Dreams? When you forget them? In that single line was the entire heart of the myth. Forget and you are haunted. Remember and you are responsible. And maybe that's why even now the Strigoi matters. Because it doesn't just ask to be believed. It asks to be remembered, to be grieved properly, to be named, to be spoken of in truth not as monster or martyr, but as part of our own unfinished stories. In literature, we talk about closure. But what if closure is a myth itself? What if the healthiest thing we can do is live with our ghosts, not banish them? Across the world, there's a growing recognition that trauma is not linear, that healing is not clean, that the past lives in our bones, in our language, in the way we flinch at certain silences. The Strigoi is the embodiment of that truth. It is not evil. It is not gone. It is a shape for things we can't quite name, And a warning, don't let the nameless rot. As we close this journey, we return to a question we asked at the beginning. What makes a monster? Is it the one who returns from the grave, or the one who buried them wrong? Perhaps the Strigoi is not here to scare us, but to teach us, to remind us that fear can be sacred, that memory is moral, that stories are how we keep the dead warm. And if that's true, then the Strigoi is not just Romanian. It's human. So the next time the wind moves strangely, or a name appears in your mind out of nowhere, or a dream leaves you aching in the morning, light a candle, say a name, tell a story, because maybe, just maybe, that's all the dead ever asked of us. To be felt, to be faced, to be forgiven. And that is how we unmake a monster. Let's look back. We began with an image of something stirring in the soil of names whispered in sleep, of a presence older than Dracula and deeper than fiction. We explored how the Strigoi emerged from rural fear, grew into folklore, and outlasted both empires and religions. We met rulers who twisted the myth for power. We saw villagers offer ritual to rest the soul. We witnessed how Western fantasy reshaped the legend into a commodity, and how Romanians responded with defiance, grief, and pride. We watched as the myth fractured into politics, cinema, and superstition. Then, against all odds, how it returned adapted for therapy, revived through art, transformed by young voices who wanted to belong to something both ancient and personal. Each version of the Strigoi was different, and yet at its heart it remained the same. A cry for remembrance, a refusal to be erased. There's a Romanian saying, Cine uită e pedepsit să retrăiască. He who forgets is doomed to relive. That is the true haunting. Not the fangs, not the claws, but forgetting. And so we gather our stories. We share them like bread. We pass them from mouth to mouth, not to frighten, but to feed something sacred. Because a culture that remembers its monsters also remembers its wounds. And maybe it's healing. So let this be your invitation, not just to light a candle, but to ask the old questions, to wonder what your family never said, to listen for echoes in your own history. Because there is wisdom in the undead, and as long as someone listens, the story is never truly over.